This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. Jonathan, could you move to the next slide, please?
I can. Hold on. Oops. Let's go to that. There we go.
So for today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Jonathan Newman, ICG member and owner of Deep Research. Jonathan is a social anthropologist who slowly drifted into market research. His PhD looked at coffee markets and his postdoctoral work looked at the alternative health and security markets. He was also funded by the Higher Education Academy to look at the market for education. His publications cover these areas as well as matters around research methods, ethics, healthcare, automated vehicles, and peace processes. He prefers the commercial sector to academia because he thinks it's faster moving, just as intriguing, and a lot more fun. The aim of his webinar today is to show the benefits of using an anthropological lens to understand more about whatever research you are conducting. Jonathan would love this to be a discursive, so please type your questions into the chat box as we go along and have them ready to ask at the end. Next slide, please. So Indiefield, we're very grateful to Indiefield for sponsoring this webinar. They're a UK-based fieldwork company and can help you with all types of market research fieldwork and recruitment, both in the UK and internationally. The company provides quantitative and qualitative services across a range of sectors. Recent projects include recruiting and interviewing 50 luxury sports car drivers, recruiting 200 van drivers to a venue in Leeds, recruiting children and parents for a project about video games, recruiting numerous doctors and nurses, and recruiting top IT directors for a project about cloud storage solutions. The types of project Indiefield delivers are extremely varied, both in terms of the sample required and the fieldwork method used. Please call on Indiefield next time you need any fieldwork or recruitment. And the next slide, please, Jonathan. So before I hand over to Jonathan, here are some more webinars and events we have planned for you over the autumn. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars. Sponsorship normally costs £120 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. Please contact Lucy if you'd like to know more. So next slide, please, Jonathan. And it's time to hand over to you, Dr. Jonathan Newman, ICG member and owner of Deep Research. And if you'd like to close these few slides down, Jonathan, and then open up yours, and it's over to you.
Okay, let me sort that out. And let's go to there. Is that up on screen? Yeah. Good.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll go on mute. Over to you.
And I know it says, put your stuff in the chat. I might not be able to juggle the chat and the presentation, but we can definitely do things at the end. And if someone sees something in the chat that desperately needs saying, then just interrupt and say it. There was a nice little introduction, so I don't have much more to say regarding that. Just basically, I've been looking at markets in one way or the other throughout my academic thing, from coffee markets, alternative health markets, security arms markets, addiction markets, automated vehicles, and I've also done some other stuff around peace processes, emergency service personnel and how they respond to accidents, and I've done stuff around ethics and methodology. So really, that's a bit of background, but let's get down to the talk. So, I mean, what we'll be looking at in no particular order is what social anthropology is, why it's relevant to market researchers. We'll be looking at the lens of anthropology and the method, or a method. I'll give you a brief history of anthropology. We'll try and focus the lens. We'll try and hone it down and try and see a way of incorporating that into a continual method. So it's not just something you do, it's some here and there, it's something you do as part of daily life. And the whole thing becomes a reflexive encounter. So it reflects back on yourself, and you see who you are in the process, because that really is a key part of the method. And I'm not going to do it in a nice linear fashion for you. And I'll come to why that is in a second. But let's pull back a second, because basically what I can do, or since many years of anthropology, is I can talk to anyone about anything, and I can still ask them questions that makes them think deeply about what they're doing and provides them with space to express things they kind of knew but they never managed to articulate. In fact, I do that all the time wherever I go. And how's that possible? Because I don't really know anything about them or their worlds or their speciality. At the weekend I was talking to African drummers, and this weekend I'm going to talk to indigenous people from the Amazon who are over for a sort of talk. It's got nothing to do with my knowledge. It's got to do with the application of a craft. I don't know all about their worlds, so I apply a craft, and that craft takes me and the person I'm talking to deeper into their world. And what I kind of, if you want to give it a name, call that ethnography. It's a form of ethnography. What is ethnography? Well, many opinions out there. I'm not going to deal with that today. I'll just show you a form of it. And I'm going to show you a little bit about what lies beneath that craft, what lies beneath that craft of going into someone else's world, and how you can hone that craft, how you can sort of develop it. So the best way to listen to this talk is actually the same way to do ethnography, is to put our questions and our purposes down. Everything we want to know, just put it down for a bit and try to understand them, the research subject, in this case me, as they choose to describe their world, regardless of what you can get from it. So however I choose to describe it, you just got to go with that. And in my experience, the more I can put down my questions, the more I can put down my purposes, the more I can actually start to listen to the subtleties of what's going on, and the more I seem to get from it. And ironically, the more my questions are answered, and they're answered far more comprehensively than if I just went in my stuff. So the talk is intended to partially reflect ethnographic experience. It's a jigsaw that comes together through patience and reflection on your part. It's not the top 5 anthropological hacks for your research toolkit. It's not that. But in a way, by the end of it, maybe it will be that. But it's about that listening and coming together and understanding people, even if they don't express things as we want them to express it, in ways we can even understand. So what is ethnography? Well, I'll tell you what it isn't. It isn't prescriptive. It's not vigorous debate. It's not weighing the pros and cons of their position. Instead, it's the archaeology of revelation. It's the brushing back of the dust to see what's there, and to keep brushing and keep reviewing it until the form makes sense to us, not in a critical manner where we go, I like this, I don't like this, but we can appreciate it as it is for what's being said. And we, as the researcher, as the observer, we can derive existential meaning from it. And I'll come to that in a second. And we can derive our existential meaning from it, perhaps in a similar manner to the storyteller we're listening to. Because ethnographic research is a reflexive process. It's a positioning of ourselves. And existential is a big word to use at 11 o'clock in the morning. I appreciate that. But anthropology is about who we are. And if it's about who we are, it's about who I am. And for you, it's about who you are. It's how in different places and different times we see ourselves in our existence. And there's a great book called The 7 Brief Lessons on Physics. And the guy describes all these aspects of physics. And then he says at the end, so who are we? If all that's going on, what are we? Who are we? And he takes it back to the individual, he takes it back to that person. And anthropology is doing the same. And once you grasp that, of course, you can get more from the people you talk to. That's how we shape the world around us. That world is simultaneously shaping us. And it's about that interplay between the two. So who we are as we go to the hospital for a consultation with the oncologist, or who we are as we drink a can of Coke, who we are waiting for a number 50 bus to take us to work, or who we are on daily medication to get through a working day. Wherever the anthropologist encounters the human, be it in a Bedouin tent or on the edges of the Sahara or a busy bar on Saturday night in London, they find themselves confronted by the same thing. These are people making sense of themselves in an environment surrounded by other actors. Now look at this word actors. And whether by words, actions, expectations, silences, technologies, or landscapes, these actors are constantly telling each other about the world. And the art of ethnography is to listen to the noise and capture little bits of the conversation. And when I say actors, I'm not just talking people. The anthropologist Anna Singh refers to a more than human sociality, and she's written a great book which describes this, The Mushroom at the End of the World. She's written many other books too, and it's quite an accessible book. I should have put it on the list, I forgot. So it's not just people. And in fact, Bruno Latour and John Law, they refer to actants, because as we say actors, we make it very human. He's talking about actants, and I'm going to unpack this for you as we go. Because the lens of anthropology, at this current point in time, it'll change. It used to be something else, it'll change again. But right now, where it's really going on in the subject is we're looking at a relational existential ontology. And that sounds very big, doesn't it? But relational means that our very being and our very understanding of the world and being in the world is through a set of relations. And that is our existence. That's how we understand ourselves in the world. That's how we understand the world around us. And that's how the bits of the world around us interact with us too. So let's have a little look at that in a bit more depth. So here's a very brief history of anthropology. It's about traveling encounters. The ancient Greeks were doing anthropology. It didn't all start 100 years ago. That's a myth. People have been doing it for years. You and I do it. Everyone does it. Everyone's an anthropologist because it's about an encounter. And those encounters have geopolitical and historic context. There's a purpose for these journeys. And there's a certain interpretation of others. So on these encounters, we meet something else. We meet something which we kind of don't identify as us, which we constantly do. I do that when I go next door. And how do we do that? And what do we bring as we observe it? Do we bring our own frames of mind? Do we bring our own questions? Do we bring our own sense of the world to understand someone else's sense of the world? And how do we measure it? What's going on there? And there's of course endless variation as 2 points meet. But let's get to the heart of that. And I don't know if part of my screen's in the way of the black and white photo, but it's a fascinating photo which much has been talked about over the time. And this is Malinowski, Bronislaw Malinowski, around 1917 in the Trobriand Islands, with the Trobriand Islanders, having this long-term ethnographic encounter with them, and writing several books about them and how their local economy and their magical gardens. And he's writing to Freud as well about issues about patrilineal and matrilineal forms of authority and things like that. But let's get to the photo because it's more interesting. What's going on there? What do we see? What do we see as we look at it? Because in a sense, we see this encounter with the other. Or is this just people sitting around? Is this just people sitting around and there is no other? Are we reading the other into this? Or is this Malinowski seeing the other and we're seeing people around? And of course, this is 1917. They had to sit for this photo. This is very posed. This isn't a little snap on your phone, maybe a 2-minute sit or whatever it is to get this just right. And what's he seeing? Oh, this is the question. And of course, what we end up with are these little examples down beneath, which is the sense of meeting an alien, meeting something that isn't us. And here we have the whole colonial project, which of course, for its own reasons, creates alien others, of which of course the colonists put themselves at the top of the pile. maybe the others are putting themselves at the top of the pile. What's really going on? Because what's really going on, and I think what Malinowski's quite well aware of, if you look at that photo, is it's a two-way street. He's not looking at the others any more than they are looking at him. He is just as alien to them as they are to him. And he is just as strange and quirky and full of irrational stuff as they are to him. And they are trying to make sense of him as much as he's trying to make sense of them. It's an encounter. And we can also, as we will see, we could also look at what he's sitting on, and the materials and the plants and the rocks and the stones. And actually, there's a whole lot of meeting going on there. It isn't just people. There's some, he's got a white shirt and some trousers and those little glasses, which are rather trendy still. And he's got those palm trees and the rocks and the rope binding it. There's a whole set of things coming together in this photo, plus the camera, which we can't quite see, and the whole development of those plates. So there's an encounter going on, and whilst the conscious eyes are between two groups of people, there's actually more going on, and we will explore that in a minute. Let's say we come in waves. Ethnography doesn't deliver straightforward narrative. And the other thing is, as we look at them, are they them, or do those them look at each other and see further differences? This boy is younger than the older man. How do they see each other? So anthropology is constantly connected to this encounter. And it's not something we should dismiss. It's always go back to photos like this and try and understand, what am I seeing and whose eyes am I seeing it for? And what questions do I hold? And as we progress and certainly get into some of the resources I'm going to show you later, this is what people are talking about. So, who you are is where you are, or at least who you are and where you've been is who you are. And I gave a talk about anthropology to the Women's Institute, and I said, this is the Papua New Guinea Women's Institute. I said it as a joke. To which they said, oh, right, I imagine there's a branch there. And I don't think they are the Women's Institute, but immediately they imagine this group in their own eyes. And you know what, some of that might be right, but some of that is definitely wrong. And when I were to talk to these women, they've got a different relationship with that plants than I have here. Those bags, those clothes, the men in the background, the hats, the beards, the buildings, and I imagine them to be living in these houses here, but maybe actually they live in the houses right at the back of that picture, which are modern apartments. And if they lived in either of those, who would they be? Would they be someone slightly different to the people living in the apartments? Are they slightly different to the ones in the house? What's it like to live in a house like that? What's it like to live in a modern apartment with houses like that nearby? Who are these people? How do they see it? How do you grow up in that world? How does the world become? Does the plant become important, or is the plants behind important? Is there a sense of the natural environment? What is that to these people? And is it different to my own? But once again, I'm entering that other field of who are they? But what I've really got to do is say, who am I? So here we are at the 21st birthday party of the ICG. Are we really any different from the people in this photo? Yes and no. We are incredibly different. There'll be points where we can't even communicate some of those differences. But at the same time, we're caught up in a lot of balloons, some probably fake foliage, drinks glasses, a nice little tiled floor, as I seem to remember it, a very busy, noisy bar, all these sounds coming in, very different sounds to these sounds. Something else is going on. I'm living in a different world there. So in order to understand them, I need to understand me. And somewhere in that picture, I'm sitting there. So let's move to a different way of describing the same thing. So I'll try and get you into the craft a bit more. There lies the encounter. So there's very complicated philosophical ways of describing this, but here's another way of describing it. Imagine if you were, as a metaphor, that you are a boat on the water. And a lot of people see that as their way of the world. They think they are fully in control of the world. They decide where to go. They decide what happens. And every time they look down, it looks more or less the same. And they just have to navigate a little bit here. But it's always the same water underneath. And they're just deciding where they go. Yes, the water pushes the boat a little bit, but it's not too much. And there's another way of looking at it, as who you are in the world. And that is as a drop of water. That you are no different. If you look around the room at you, you are no different from the world around you. The lines you have drawn and the meanings you have given to everything you can see, and every story you have told is stuff you've brought to the table. That there is no distinction between me and the cup other than the story I tell it. And I've got the cat sitting over there somewhere. Where is she? There we go. Who attacked me earlier on a briefing call. I say the cat, but is there much distinction? Only by the rules I lay down. And as I look at those lines that I draw, if I start discussing why this is different from me, then I start discussing who I am and how I see the world. So if I'm a drop of water, and you can just switch between the two, if you like, in your imagination, if you are no distinction between all this, then what are you? And really the craft is to see yourself as a boat made from water. That's the craft. So that you sit on the balance between people who are making their way in the world and yourself making the way in the world of which you just make the decisions. And actually a world that is constantly pushing and shaping you, of which there are no distinctions, and all those distinctions are the stories you tell. So this is the craft which you kind of hone in daily life. I'm going to give you 2 more relationships we have, and then I'll open it up a little bit more. So this one is about who we are. And it's very, very useful in market research to know who we are. So here's a hamster, and this is something I did. The hamster got out, and it was in the room. And it's running around, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. I took the hamster into the university, and I popped it down, and everyone sat on the floor. We shut the door. I said, well, what does the hamster see? What happens to the hamster in this room? And everyone goes, well, it's smaller. I said, yeah, but what's this room? And they say, well, the chair's not the chair. No, the chair's not a chair to a hamster. And the window, well, that's not really a window. And the door, well, the door's not a door, and the hamster can't even reach the handle. And then there were some little curtains, and the hamster started running up the curtains, and clearly they weren't a curtain to the hamster. The hamster was in a very, very different room to us, very different. But that difference was 100% valid. It was in a different space entirely, but its experience of that world was 100% valid. We can't really quite describe our worlds to each other, but they're both valid. They both coexist. And then we have to look at what the human body does to the world. The door handle is at the right height. Well, it is the right height if you're who I am. But if you're a bit younger, or your bodies are differently shaped, or you have other bodies, it doesn't work. You need a certain strength to open that door. And this chair is, well, this chair's about right for me, but it wouldn't be right for other people. So the human body is constantly moving through this world. And then we can look at how that happens. And we can also look at the stories we tell about the body. We look at the body and we start drawing lines around it, and we're well aware of that. We draw demographic lines around age and ethnicity. Well, not even ethnicity, but to this degree we call it, let's just call it color at this point, because ethnicity is a bit deeper than that. And we draw it about hair and no hair, and fingers and cleanliness and dirt, and we start putting all this stuff on. Did it exist before? I'm not sure, but it exists now, and it's very ingrained. So we can start looking at all these different things we do to the body and all the ways the body is in the world. And we start to get to a point where the body embodies the world. It brings into the world, it starts to reflect aspects of the world. And we can see how it interacts with that world, how the world interacts with it. The world in it, if you like, a material, physical sense, how those interactions happen, and the world is, if you like, another narrative sense, whereby the stories we're telling upon the body. So we can look at the body, we can look at senses differently. I'll show you all the different things we can look at. But there's just one example. We're not a hamster, we're a human, and that means we have a different way of the world. And the cat's back on my lap, it might bite in a minute. So. And here's my anthropological moment where I started to see the lens, and it happens well after the PhD. I'm teaching a course on material culture, and there's to me, one of the most beautiful articles, and I've put it in the list and sent you a link to it, by Bruno Latour. And he's a French philosopher, but he's got an anthropological background. He did an ethnographic study of science labs and looked at how scientists made science, and he does a lot of work on that. But he writes a very deep and complex article, which is hard to read at times, but it's worth the time and effort. But there's one page which stands out. And he says this, and for researchers who are involved in market research, it's very beautiful. He says, but you've got to get your head around it. Some people really don't like it. Just a word of warning, but I think it's very enlightening. He says, on my desk is a hammer. And if I look at that hammer, it looks compact, and it looks like it's very solid and very certain. He said, but the iron in the handle, the iron in the hammerhead, that came from millions of years ago. That's the iron ore. That came from millions and millions of years ago. And he said, the wood in the handle, well, that was from trees that were cut down 60 years ago. And when I put my hand on that hammer, when I hold it, I put my hand in a garland of time. It's from different times. He said, it's from different places too. He said, the iron is from the Ruhr. The handle is from the Ardennes, and it was put together in a factory. He's done his research. It was put together in a factory in this place, and I bought it from a market in that place, and now it sits on my desk in this place. It's from many times, and it's from many places. And he says, and in fact, the hammer is related in one way or the other to all other hammer-like objects. It's related to those early stones. It's related to me picking up my stapler and trying to bash something in with it. It's related to everything hammer-like that has ever been. It's got cousins and relations and aunties and uncles. And it's got time and it's got place. This hammer has genealogy. This hammer is a being in its sense. And then he says, I mean, that's quite big, because then we can look around us and we can go, oh, everything's kind of got its own sense of being. Everything, this cup is from many times, many places, and is related to many cups. But then he goes on and he says, look, when I pick up this hammer, it tells my clumsy arm what to do. And we know this is the case. The stapler, I think I'm in control of the stapler, but actually it's teaching me. It's teaching me how to use it. The cup teaches me how to use it. If I get it wrong, well, in this case, the cat will get very wet. Everything, every object is teaching me how to use it. An example I often give is a basketball, because it's got a real strong bounce, hasn't it? The basketball shows your body, shows your hand how to start moving it. And it shows you through trial and error how not to. And he goes further. And he says, this stuff's got morality. It tells you what's right and wrong. It's got genealogy, it's got morality. And then he takes it one stage further. And he points out the startlingly obvious about technology. And technology is the made world. So let's get rid of the made world. Let's just get rid of everything that's ever been made. Where are you? You're sitting in a field, or you're sitting in a desert. You're sitting somewhere stark naked without anything for miles around, and that's your existence. And Latour says that's not human. You've got no sense of, if you live like that, there is no sense of time and place. We can't distinguish one point from another point. In fact, human history as we understand it has always had this relationship with made things. And he says, what makes you human is your relationship with the technology. Just as you think you've got relationships with other actors, the people, you have a relationship with people and with technology. And I've got a relationship with this cat at the moment. So you have a relationship with things. Now, this is where it really blew me away. What happens when you step back from all that and look at the world around you? Has there ever been a point in your life where you weren't surrounded by the made world? It's everywhere. And it's by exploring that we start to understand things. And by exploring that within research, how people relate to objects, how the objects shape them, then we can just keep going for ages. So let's have a quick look at this. These are just some things. Technologies I've discussed. That's a bit about other species, but there's more than cats. There's plants, there's microbes, there's all sorts of things. We've got senses, we've got our relationships to the sun, the wind, the rain, and you don't think that affects us? Everyone's talking climate change. We're starting to understand that these environments affect us and they affect who we are in the world and affect how we are being in the world. And if we go into other cultures, these things are living things, and we have to accept we only see them as non-living because of the stories we grew up with. We can look at time, spaces, dimensions, movements, and we can look at transcendence. There are many, many states of transcendence. For example, going to watch the football on a Saturday, the transcendent state. And if we look at all this stuff pushing and pulling us, are we anything more than a jellyfish, a land-based jellyfish? We think of the jellyfish as pushed around by the currents of the day. But we're pushed around. I'm pushed by this chair. It's shaping my very body. The chair in European life doesn't come for about 400 years, apart from the aristocracy. So it's quite new. It's 400 years old in our lives. I mean, it's changed me. I don't squat anymore. It's changed my body. It's changed my health. It's changed how I am wherever I go and how I talk to people and what I expect and what I need. Every single object is doing that. And every part of, the bus times are doing that. The cat meowing for food is doing that. I'm absolutely being shifted by everything. And amongst all this melee, I'm telling stories, and everything around me is telling stories through its practices, through performing, different practice and performance. I'll discuss that later if you want to, but through our words, spoken or written, or our sounds, through symbols. There's a tiny symbol that goes a very long way, and through our landscapes, the way we see things. And there's other ways of storytelling too. And in all that, there's coherence and distinction, or if you like, there's similarity and difference. There's points where we pull things together and say these are the same, these are distinct. It's just part of who we are, part of many species are. And it's a fluidity. This doesn't stop. Time doesn't stop. It keeps moving, and it moves us. And things change. Things are in constant change. There isn't a static. And here is probably, if there's one little takeaway from this, it is a great anthropological question written by this guy, Eduardo Biberios de Castro, who influenced David Graeber enormously. He's a sort of more famous anthropologist, recently died, in a book called The Relative Native. And he's trying to understand stuff which doesn't make sense to us. He's trying to understand incommensurable worlds, if you like. But he asks a question which is so useful. He says, what has worth? How does it have worth? How do people organize themselves around that worth? What will they do for that worth? How will they move it? When does it have worth? Where does it have worth? And of course, he says what has worth has power. And then we can really sit back and, we can look at the worth of the stapler. We can ask those questions about of an office worker about their stapler and when it has worth and when it doesn't have worth and what's it worth to them. And we can just keep going into the value of the world around us, because once we look at desire and the need for things, it's intrinsically linked to worth, but worth is itself constructed by all those stories around us and by the world around us. And it's all shifting a bit too. So, is anthropology a way of research? It certainly is. And we can go from Malinowski studying the Trobriand Islanders to someone studying the queue for the latest iPhone in Oxford Street, I think that was, and making a joke of it. But I think it's more than that. And I think this is the key, is to make that lens, to look at that relational, existential, ontological lens, and that constant questioning, to make that a way of life. And I love this photo because that to me is a perfect holiday. I mean, I just don't want a beach with a view. I want a beach where I can go around the docks and talk to the people who work there. And I need the stimulus. And of course, there'll be the sandflies and there'll be all sorts of other beach things which I can interact with. And it's about constantly questioning that. There's some lovely interviews in the anthropological literature of interviews with plants, interviews with machines, trying to see our interaction with these things and trying to understand who I are. So, you know, life for me is walking around with a notebook in my hand. Life for me is constantly, I can't be a market researcher. I'm a market researcher looking at market research as another way of life. What is all this stuff market researchers do? Who are they? How does that work? Why do people want market research? What's all that about? How do we end up there? And how do I end up on a meeting like this? And what does all this mean? And I'll sit and I'll take my notes. And the way to get the craft is to bring it into the everyday life. And then it gets interesting, because beneath that photo, something else is going on. Beneath all those notes, all that constant note taking. Because what happens is you constantly hear these stories of what has worth, and thereby what has power. And like those you study, you find yourself just full of stories, incomplete snippets that fill you and place you in your world amongst others. They also put you on your own. You're whole, but you're fragmented. You're fantastically interconnected, and yet almost in isolation. And that is the research subject, but it's also the researcher too. And there's a cacophony of research notes that finally form a picture. Because until we understand our connections, we're empty in a void. And each connection is the arrival of many other connections, and all are infused with their own histories. So the craft is to nurture your awareness of your location and how you're connected to multiple histories that gathered you and your surroundings together. And as you craft that in your own life, the questions flow, because you're trying to see it in someone else's life too. Because I can neither know myself without knowing my world, nor know the world without knowing myself. And like the world I'm living, I'm interconnected, yet my connections are incomplete, they're fluid, and they're relative to other connections. I mean, existence, one way or the other, is a shared experience and is bathed in these formative histories. So here's some resources, and you can click these at your leisure. These are the sort of big associations in Europe and America and the UK, and the Association of Social Anthropologists have subgroups on the anthropology of Britain, the anthropology of time, but there are anthropological associations and collectives around the world. Here's some more resources. You can see Latin American, Australian, Canadian, Finnish, but there's loads. Just go looking for them if you need them. And much more interesting resources. These are the people sort of out there, sometimes communicating very clearly, because obviously some of this is academic knots at times, but some of this is very open and trying to be accessible and trying to explore all sorts of things. And I mean, you know, I can always do this talk off the latest email that came in, and this one I got at 7 o'clock this morning, was they're looking for someone to do research on consumption and Buddhism in the age of garbage. And the person asking for it has written stuff on what is the value of a Tibetan prayer wheel, Plastic Asia, Material Ambiguities and Cultural Imaginaries, Plastic Skinscapes in Tibetan Buddhism, and Buddhism and Waste, the Excess, Discard and Afterlife of Buddhist Consumption. But you can see, perhaps, I hope you can see, that with some of these things, some of these tools, we can craft that. There's lots of books here. You just go and have a look at them. Air Mobilities is an ethnography of different airports, how they work. Relative Native, first chapter, brilliant in my mind. It takes you somewhere. Existential Anthropology is about storytelling, practice of everyday life. You can says it for itself. Multi-Species Saloon is about our world around other species and what they mean. A fantastic article by Karen Barad in there, who used to be some sort of physicist. Brilliant. If you want stuff about field work, Michael Tausig, that book, I swear I saw this, absolutely brilliant. History of Anthropology, that's another great one. Posthuman is what this really is all about, this decentering of the human as the center of everything and actually understanding its relational. Rainforest to Shamans, if you want to go into a world very different to your own, and the rest stands for itself. And that's it really. So I have gone on way longer than I intended, or at least 10 minutes longer, but now I'm very much open to questions and I hope some of that made sense. And if it didn't, let's talk.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really feel that we've literally just scratched the surface of this, but very, very interesting and great to start thinking a little bit out of the box as well. There's one comment. Oh no, that's just. I'm going to stay on mute and off camera as I'm also working for a deadline this afternoon. But as a recent ICG buddy, really wanted to support Jonathan today. Okay, well, that's just a word of support. Any questions coming through from anybody else?
Joe.
No?
Joe.
Hello. Hi everybody. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Found that really, really fascinating. I've been thinking a lot recently about the anthropological project as a way of knowing, and you've kind of touched on that a lot. And I was just interested in how you talk to clients about buying you as a vehicle towards knowledge and kind of persuading them that the value in your services is you developing knowledge and then being able to transfer that knowledge to them, as opposed to answering a question or delivering an insight. And I'm just quite interested in that shift from insight to knowledge, and if you've had any experience of that.
Oh, Joe, I mean, that's my dream. I'd love to do that. And I tend to, you know, someone asked me what they thought was a simple question. They just want to know, they've done their desktop research about some finance app, and you know, there's a lot of money behind this thing, and they wanted to know how the customer. But what they were talking about was money sharing. It was fascinating. And money sharing. There's journals on money sharing, but they were just noticed a little niche, and I was saying, well, you know, if you want to understand this, if you want to understand what people are doing and save yourself a lot of time, understand how people share money around the world. And look, we can look at it in all these various ways. And then they went elsewhere to you know, just update on their app, which gave people a star or something when they did something. They might be right. Who am I to judge? But yeah, there was another app. They kept asking why. They said, we want to know why. There was so, and of course, eventually we come to why. Why do people learn? Well, you know, people are very driven, and they targeted driven people, driven professionals who wanted to learn. Why did they want to learn? Well, when you talk to them, it became very apparent. There was their own crisis. Who were they without the learning? They felt totally inadequate and disconnected. One of them refers to it as bare existence. And so, you know, the answer actually isn't they just need this. Just give them. The answer is actually, well, you know, if you can tap in to that desperate need to be somebody through learning, then you've got it. But you know, they're looking at other things. Maybe is what. Short answer is, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, same.
What's your background? Oh, sorry, Sally.
No, go ahead.
I just wondered what's your background?
So I've been a social researcher for about 20 years, and I've done a bunch of work in Africa and Asia, and in fact Papua New Guinea as well. So went out and for international broadcast, the Australian Broadcast Corporation, looking at how people use media and news, which was fascinating. And more recently, I did an MA in visual anthropology at the University of Manchester. So I'm trying to I'm trying to bring in that idea of kind of knowledge versus insight, and the idea of visual methods as ways of looking and ways of knowing. But I find it quite hard because, especially with the visual stuff, people actually want a visual output rather than visual kind of ways of knowing. So yeah, I'm just really interested in the way you talk about anthropology as a way of knowing, and I've yet to crack how to talk to clients about that properly, but
Yeah.
Trying.
But I think we'll get there.
Yeah.
So Jonathan, yes, sort of developing on from that, I'm very curious to hear how you sell your added value. It sounds as though probably you're a qualitative market researcher with an anthropology background. So how do you present that when you're going to a client and you're competing with other qualitative researchers who don't have that? What is it that you can bring to the table that helps you sell yourself to clients?
I mean, I'm lousy at marketing myself. I have no pretenses there. No, if it doesn't come to me, I don't. What would I like to say in those situations? What I'd like to say is, let's see what's out there rather than let's see what you want. I've just started doing some work with another ICG member or their company, and that's what they wanted. That's why they brought me in. They said, look, we just want to know what it is before we start exploring the bits of it. Just go there, find out what's going on, find out how it works, and here's our rough questions, but just go where it is. And to me, that was like, they understood where I was coming from, that I can I mean, I didn't say it, but my anthropological method is, if you want to practice this, go to the wrong pub. We all go to the right pubs. We go to the pubs we like, but actually go to the ones you keep avoiding and stay there until it all makes sense and you love it. And that's a process, but it is about going places and understanding people on their own terms, or understanding objects on their own terms from where they're sitting on a shelf. Maybe it doesn't matter, because as we say, once we come back to actants, once we come back to relations, we're just seeing how the whole thing pieces together and the histories behind it. So if we can understand the landscape, to quote Sun Tzu, The Art of War, if you can understand the battlefield and arrive there before your enemy, you've won the battle. And my encounter with market research is a lot of companies are very sort of set on the course, and there's obvious reasons for that. Sometimes it's very pragmatic. They've been on that course for a long time. But to see things afresh, to see things with fresh eyes, and to see all these factors coming into it without having to narrow it down to give me what works, that's what I do.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, Sally.
It does, absolutely. It sounds like something which you rarely have the luxury. I hate to use that term, but you rarely have the luxury of the time to be able to do something like that. It sounds as though it's the sort of thing where you want to spend a month in an environment, at least understanding how it works.
There is a big sort of debate about how long does research take, and some of it comes from the European tradition, which had its colonies, so people went and did research over years because it was long travel. But the North Americans, they had the indigenous tribes on their doorstep, so they used to go for the weekend and do their ethnography at the weekend. You can do ethnography in half an hour. It's what you're looking at, and it's the way you're looking at. You get different stuff the longer you're there, but you get an awful lot in a short time. It doesn't really matter. It just gets you something different.
Yeah, sounds absolutely fascinating. Any other questions from anyone? No? Nobody wants to put their camera on and join in the conversation? Okay, well, Jonathan, you gave us a fantastic list of different resources that we can look at for anybody who's interested in further reading. So I assume that you're happy for us to put your slides up on the website along with the recording of this webinar. Yeah, that's fantastic. So I think unless anybody's got any last minute questions, it just remains to say thank you very much indeed for your time, for taking us through this. It really, as I say, it was scratching the surface of it, and I'm sure there's an awful lot more to understand behind all that, but it was really interesting from my perspective. And thank you to everybody else for logging in and joining us today. And please do come back and watch another webinar at some future date. Hopefully we'll find some other interesting topics for you to tune into. So that's it from us. Thanks again to everybody. Thanks, Joe, for your question, and see you all again, hopefully very soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
And Joe, I can find you and we'll chat. I want to chat more.
Yeah, likewise, definitely. Thanks, Jonathan.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. See you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.